Thank you. Good evening. Yes, bins aren't everyone's idea of an attractive source of a meal, but for me they've always struck a chord as a great opportunity. I think I will have the first picture just as a backdrop for my preamble. I was brought up really pretty much a hunter-gatherer, and this always seemed to me a hunter-gathering in an urban context. It really started for me when I was a young teenager. I was living in Sussex, where I live now, with my father, and he was full of stories of his childhood on a pre-war farm, and I set about recreating as much as I could of that. So first I got ferrets to catch rabbits with, and then I got chickens, and eventually at the age of 15 I got pigs. And I wanted to feed them in the traditional way, on food waste. Humans domesticated pigs 6,000 years ago in order to turn food waste back into food, as in pork. And so that's what I did. I went to my local baker and started collecting all the bread from them at the end of the week. 6 or 7 sackloads of bread came in. I went to my school kitchens and asked them if they could keep aside all the untouched dishes, heaps and heaps of pie and macaroni cheese and all sorts of delicious things that my school friends had turned their noses up at. My pigs were delighted to scoff down, so I took them home in these big yellow buckets. My car, I used to drive someone to school with me, and he was constantly complaining the car stank, as you can imagine, of swill buckets actually. So I used to take them home, and my pigs used to just squeal with anticipation the moment they saw these yellow buckets being hoiked out the back of the car. And then when it came to slaughter, it was excellent. The pigs went back to the school, and I was set up the same car, selling it out the back to all my school friends' parents. So that was my little money-making trade as a young teenager. It was great for me. Lots of free food, lots of free pocket money, and a good laugh to boot. It was only when I really started collecting all of this stuff, the bakery waste I've mentioned, I collected from a local greengrocer, also the local market, and a farmer down the road who was growing potatoes, and he had all these big potatoes that the supermarkets didn't want. They were just too big, or you know, or too wonky. And it struck me that a lot of the food I was collecting to feed to my pigs was actually fit for human consumption, and that this wasn't right. And I also had been around the back of the supermarkets and seen this kind of thing. And I talked to supermarket bosses and I said, look, couldn't you at least separate out the stuff that I can feed to my pigs? Let me turn it back into food. And they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to tell me how much food they were wasting, what they were doing with it. They were putting it in bins, locking the skips, and off they would be trucked to be buried in landfill sites, where, of course, they decompose into methane and contribute to global warming. And I thought, well, you know, this is going all over the country, and it struck me as something that worth finding out a little bit more about. But the real revelation came one morning when I was feeling peckish. I hadn't had time for breakfast. I'd zoomed out. My sow had just littered, and I was just chucking these sackloads of bread out to my pigs, and there was this sun-dried tomato loaf. It used to crop up in the sacks occasionally, and it always had that strong sun-dried tomato flavour, and it was still soft and it looked good. So I broke it open, sat down with my pigs and had my breakfast quickly on the hoof. And that was the first time that I practiced what I later learnt other people called freeganism, and it became a journey for me. When I eventually went up to university, I was collecting stuff from the local market, but I once got into a conversation with a homeless man called Spider. He had a spider web on his face, and he said, oh yeah, you know, there's loads of food, you can go down to the Sainsbury's skip. And I said, well, that's very kind of you, but you know, you guys are depending on that stuff, and I don't want to take anything that you might otherwise eat. And he said, no, mate, you don't understand. There is enough food in these bins for all the homeless people in Britain. And he took me down to this underground bay underneath the Sainsbury's. And it was right. There were just sackloads and sackloads of food, ready meals, fresh bread, fresh fruit and vegetables. So from then on and until now, that's really where most of my food has come from. But eating into this mountain of food, the freegans in this world are like they're feeding with teaspoons off a mountain of food waste. They can't do anything significant about it. It struck me that it has to be tackled at source. We have to find out how much food is being wasted, and that's really what I set about. And if we can just reel through some of these images one after the other, you can get a picture of the kind of stuff that I see around the back of all of our supermarkets and stores. Stop there. And so having learned as much as I could about retail food waste, and that's where I was getting my food from, I then wanted to go up the supply chain and find out how much was being wasted there as well. And so I started with manufacturers, and this is just one example. I went to a sandwich manufacturer making sandwiches for one of the big supermarkets, and they explained to me, they were actually quite proud of themselves. They were separating out not just the crust of every loaf that came into the factory, but the first slice inside the crust. That's 4 slices for every loaf of bread. 17% of every loaf that came into their factory was being separated out, and they were really proud because instead of sending it to landfill, they were sending it for anaerobic digestion to turn it into gas, to turn that into electricity. I calculated that about 0.1% of the energy that went into growing the food ended up as electricity coming out of the anaerobic digestion plant. And that's 13,000 slices of fresh bread that was going out of that factory every single day. I mean, you know, my freegan instincts were switched on, but they wouldn't let me recover any of it. However, I am pleased to say that subsequent to my suggestion that instead of paying £100 a tonne to have this shipped off and turned into gas, I said you could actually sell that stuff to a pig farmer like myself, and feed it to pigs and turn it back into food, and that is actually what they now do. It saves them about £100,000 a year. Go on one or two. I went then to farms and had a look at food waste. This was the kind of thing I was familiar with from my pig rearing days. Misshapen potatoes, all of those perfectly good to eat, but they're all going for pig feed instead of ending up on supermarket shelves. We've got a few other examples. You can see tomatoes being wasted in Tenerife, and oranges in Florida, and the next one, bananas in Costa Rica. This is happening every single day. In fact, rich countries, if you look at their entire food supply, end up wasting about 50% of everything that is produced. The next one is possibly the most distressing source of waste, and that is fish discards. 40 to 60% of all fish in European waters get chucked overboard before they even get landed. And the European Commission has treated this really, really seriously. It's an urgent problem. We're depleting the oceans, so they're going to discuss it in 2012. Don't hold your breath. The next one. So I'll come back to that. Having done what I could to expose this scandal, I've now been really encouraged by how swiftly these the changes that are required are made. This is the thing. It is shocking. It is tragic how much food is being wasted. It's a visceral reaction that I think you have. I certainly have when I see that food being wasted. And it is common sense, and it makes good business sense to avoid it. Apart from the environmental issues, and also the fact that we are, of course, depleting the world food supply by buying lots of food and chucking it away. I mean, essentially, we are taking food off the world market. That bread, some of that came off the world market. I was in Pakistan in 2008. I was on a big train ride as part of the research for my book. I took a train to Pakistan and then on through China and ultimately to Japan, which is where this photo was taken, seeing how different food waste issues were dealt with in these other countries. So I was in Pakistan, and it was the time of the food price crisis, and I went to some slums, and there were people there who were able to feed their families before 2008, but the prices just went up very slightly as a result of a pressure on supply. The demand was outstripping the supply globally, and they were no longer able to buy enough food for their families. And I knew that skips back in Britain were just piled full of bread that was off the world market, and they were buying bread from the same place or wheat from the same place. So essentially we were taking food out of these people's mouths, and I calculated that actually if you look at all the food wasted in rich countries in Europe and North America, that would be enough to feed all the billion hungry people in the world 4 times over. So apart from that moral dimension, there are common sense issues here, which is that it's actually very simple to avoid food waste. Now, whereas 5 or 10 years ago when I started talking to supermarkets, it was a real uphill struggle to get them to do anything about it. Now every single one, apart from Morrison's, are talking to charities like Fair Share and redistributing some of that food waste. It's still a very small percentage, we have a long way to go, but the signs are really positive. As Rosie mentioned a few minutes ago, back in December, I decided to sort of try and demonstrate in as graphic a way as I could how much good food was being wasted. We got donated tons of food from producers like farmers and packers and importers, and we fed 5,000 people in Trafalgar Square on a snowy day in December on food that otherwise would have been wasted. And subsequent to that, Hilary Benn has written to all the CEOs of the supermarkets telling them to donate food rather than destroy it. And most of the supermarkets have responded. They're now telling their suppliers also to donate food. Something really interesting happened at the end of last week in Parliament, and if anyone wants to do anything about this kind of thing, then please, it's quite simple, write to your MP and tell them to sign Early Day Motion 1057. Get your Blackberries out, 1057. It was tabled by Roger Williams last week, and it's a mechanism for reporting food waste, and this is an opportunity to express popular support for doing something about it. But to round off, I want to come back to one of the really sad ironies about the food waste problem. A lot of improvements are being made, but there's one where it just distresses me. After 2001, the foot and mouth outbreak happened, and a pig farmer was blamed for originating this outbreak of disease. He was alleged to have got swill from a local restaurant, which he didn't boil. The law was that you had to boil it for an hour before feeding it to your pigs to sterilize all the diseases like foot and mouth and swine fever and all of those things. And he was apparently not doing that, and a piece of infected meat, which must have been illegally imported from another country which had foot and mouth, got into his swill, got into his pig herd, and we know what happened next. Instead of deciding to enforce the law on sterilising food waste, the British government decided to ban feeding swill to pigs anymore. So this thousands of year-old tradition, swill of recycling food waste, was rendered illegal. The European Union quickly followed suit, and several of the states in America also followed suit. And there's now a patchwork across the world of countries where this safe practice, is very safe if it's properly sterilised, is now illegal. So on my journey across the world to find out what others were doing about it, I went to South Korea and Japan, where it's not illegal, it's actually mandatory. They've realised that recycling food waste in that way is the most environmentally friendly and economically beneficial thing to do. So this is a factory separating out food waste for pigs, and the next one is the best factory I visited. It all goes into that big churner, it gets sterilised, and then it gets turned into a kind of yogurt. It gets cultured by lactobacillus, and that preserves it for a couple of weeks on its way to the pig farms. And then the final one is Kame's son, this Mr. Kame, who's a pig farmer, who collects this food waste from some of the big department stores owned by Odakyu. He feeds it to his pigs, which unfortunately are not free range. That's something you could say against him, but it's Japan, there's not all that much room. And really, there's actually laws, he's not allowed to let them out. So he was feeding his pigs on this supermarket waste, essentially, and then selling his pork back to the same supermarket, and they had this big shelf in the supermarket selling eco pork. And he gave me something which made my entire train journey to Japan worth it. He gave me a big pack of sustainable food waste fed pork, which I hadn't eaten since I was 15, and is no longer possible to get in Europe. And I took it home, and by God, the taste of that pork, you have never tasted anything. It's been eating human food. There is nothing better than food waste fed pork, and hopefully one day we'll have it again in Europe. Thank you.